What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was a piece of paper everyone told you was worthless? Imagine being handed a faded, hand-drawn map, a parting gift of pure mockery from the very people who took everything else. They believe it leads to nothing but rock and ruin, a final, bitter joke at your expense. But the truth, waiting in those penciled lines, a secret buried under years of dust and neglect, was a legacy more valuable than all the land they fought to keep. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is the story of a forgotten map, a determined woman, and the home she built from the ashes of betrayal. Emma Whitcomb stood on the porch of the only home she had known for 5 years and watched the Wyoming sky bruise purple at the edges. The wind, a constant thief in this high country, stole the warmth from her thin shawl and whipped a strand of brown hair across her face. Behind her, in the warm light of the ranch house, her brother-in-law, Caleb, cleared his throat. He was a man made of hard angles and harder opinions. "It's done then," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a nail being driven into a coffin lid. Her husband Thomas's coffin had been lowered into the hard ground just 2 days prior. The ground, like the family, had not wanted to yield. Her belongings were a small, sad pile at her feet. A bedroll, a sack containing a half measure of flour and some dried jerky, and the worn dress she stood in. Caleb's wife, Martha, had made it clear that the other dresses, the furniture, the very memories inside the house, now belonged to them. They were Whitcomb things, and since Thomas was gone, Emma was no longer a Whitcomb. She was just a woman from back east who had the misfortune of being widowed on the wrong side of the mountains. Caleb shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning in protest. He held out a folded piece of foolscap, yellowed and creased. "Thomas was always drawing this nonsense," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Said it was a map to his special place, probably just some rock he liked to sit on." He pushed it into her hand. "Take it. A final piece of your husband's foolishness to remember him by." Emma's fingers closed around the paper. She remembered the nights Thomas had worked on it by lantern light, his brow furrowed in concentration, the smell of graphite and focus filling their small room. He'd called it his inheritance, a secret only the land knew. She had thought it a game, a husband's gentle fantasy. Now it was all she had of him. She unfolded it. A series of crude lines depicted the rise of the foothills, a winding creek, and a cluster of symbols near a formation of rocks that looked like a sleeping giant. In the corner, in Thomas's careful hand, were the words, "Where the water sleeps." "It's nothing," Caleb said, seeing the hope flicker in her eyes and feeling the need to extinguish it. "There's an old line shack up there, maybe, rotted through. On Mercer's grazing land, anyway. He'll run you off soon as he sees you." He turned to go back inside, the conversation over. "Good luck to you, Emma." The door clicked shut, a sound as final as a judge's gavel. Emma stood there until the last of the light bled from the sky, leaving only a smear of stars. The wind howled, a lonely and indifferent sound. She looked from the warm, closed-off light of the ranch house to the dark, rising silhouette of the foothills. One was a past that had cast her out. The other was a future drawn in pencil on a worthless piece of paper. She tied the flour sack to her bedroll, tucked the map safely into a pocket, and began to walk toward the sleeping giant, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The weight on her back was slight, but the weight in her heart was a thing of stone. The journey was a pilgrimage of dust and silence. For 2 days, Emma Whitcomb walked, following the faint cattle trails that led from the wide, grassy valley into the wrinkled foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The sun was a hammer, the nights a blanket of chilling cold. She ate the jerky sparingly, her thoughts a constant, quiet conversation with the husband she had lost. She remembered Thomas's hands, calloused from work but gentle in their touch, tracing the very lines on the map she now consulted at every turn. He hadn't been a foolish man. He had been a quiet one, a man who listened more to the land than to the loud talk of his brother. Caleb saw value in acreage and herds. Thomas, she was beginning to understand, had seen value in secrets. By the third morning, her feet were blistered and her hope was worn as thin as her boot soles. The landmarks on the map, a lightning-scarred pine, a dry creek bed that snaked like a reptile's spine, had led her deep into a country that felt older and less forgiving than any place she had ever known. And then she saw it. Tucked into a small, wind-scoured bowl below a ridge that did indeed look like the profile of a sleeping giant, was a shack. It was less a building and more a suggestion of one, its roof slumped like a tired man's shoulders, its walls the color of bone. A thin curl of smoke, pale as a ghost, rose from its stone chimney. It wasn't abandoned. A man was splitting wood beside the cabin, the rhythmic thump of his axe the only sound in the vast emptiness. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and suspenders, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He stopped his work as she approached, resting the axe head on the chopping block. His posture was wary, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He had the look of a man who had been alone for a long time and preferred it that way. "This is private land," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. "I'm looking for a place," Emma said, her own voice feeling small against the backdrop of the mountains. "My husband, he drew a map." She hesitated, then pulled the folded paper from her pocket. The man didn't move to take it. He glanced at it, then back at her face. "That's Mercer land. I'm Mercer, William Mercer." He looked her over, taking in the worn dress, the dust on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes. "You're one of the Whitcombs." Another statement, not a question. News, even bad news, traveled fast between the isolated ranches. "I was," she replied quietly. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping from her to the dilapidated shack and back again. He saw the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. He also saw the grit that had carried her this far. "This shack ain't fit for winter," he said finally. "Roof leaks. Walls are full of holes. Wind comes through like a train." He paused, looking at the pile of unsplit logs. But a second pair of hands could make a difference. He laid out the terms with the stark efficiency of a man who didn't waste words. She could stay through the winter. Her payment would be labor. They would repair the shack together. Come spring, she would move on. There was no kindness in the offer, only a hard, practical logic. He needed help. She needed shelter. It was a transaction. "I'm a hard worker," Emma promised, the words rushing out in a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. William Mercer just nodded, picking up his axe. "Wood needs stacking before dusk," he said, and turned back to his work. Emma stood for a moment, the map still clutched in her hand. This was it, the place Thomas had drawn, a derelict cabin and a wary stranger on a piece of land that wasn't hers. It felt like the punchline to Caleb's cruel joke. But as the axe fell again, ringing with the clear, sharp sound of purpose, she felt something else too. A beginning. Was this weary rancher offering a lifeline or just delaying the inevitable? What secret did Thomas Whitcomb truly believe was hidden in this forgotten corner of the world? And could it possibly be worth more than the dirt it was buried in? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of frontier justice and hidden legacies. Now, let's get back to the story, because the first whispers of winter were already on the wind. A week later, William Mercer announced he was riding to Redemption for supplies. The small settlement was little more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon, huddled by a creek crossing 2 days' ride away. He didn't invite her to come, but he didn't forbid it either. "Wagons leaving at dawn," was all he said. Emma knew this was her one chance to buy what she couldn't make or find: salt, coffee, perhaps some warmer thread for mending. She packed the few coins she had sewn into the hem of her dress and was waiting by the wagon when the first pale light touched the peaks. The ride was conducted in near total silence, the rattle of the wagon wheels and the snort of the horses filling the space between them. Redemption was a shock of noise, and people after the profound quiet of the foothills. Men in dusty hats watched her from the porch of the saloon, their eyes lingering. Women leaving the general store paused to whisper behind their hands. She was an anomaly, a lone woman, clearly in mourning, arriving with a man as famously solitary as William Mercer. As she stepped down from the wagon, a familiar voice cut through the murmuring. "Well, look what the wind blew in." Caleb Whitcomb stood there, leaning against a hitching post, a smug smile on his face. He had clearly ridden in from the main ranch. "I see you found Mercer's ruin. Didn't take you long to find another man to take care of you, Emma." His words were loud, meant for the audience of onlookers. Emma's face burned with shame, but she lifted her chin, her gaze steady. "I am taking care of myself, Caleb." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "With what? That fool map? I hear you're patching up that old shack. Polishing a turd is what that is. You'll be begging for a meal at my door before the first snow sticks." He looked past her to William, who was unloading a barrel. "You're a fool, Mercer, for taking in strays." William didn't even look up. "My business," he said, his voice flat and final. As Caleb swaggered toward the saloon, convinced he had won the exchange, an old woman sitting on a bench outside the general store caught Emma's eye. She was native, her face a beautiful road map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a deep, ancient calm. She had been watching the entire scene, her expression unreadable. As Emma passed, the woman put out a hand, her fingers surprisingly strong, and touched the pocket where the map was tucked. "Some lines show where you have been," the old woman said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "Others show where the earth keeps its promises." She looked toward the mountains, a flicker of something knowing in her gaze. "The lines that look like rivers are roots. The roots hold the oldest water." The words were strange, cryptic. Emma murmured a thank you, confused, and hurried into the store, the woman's piercing gaze feeling like it was imprinted on her back. She bought her salt and thread, her mind churning. The roots hold the oldest water. It sounded like the kind of poetry Thomas had sometimes spoken, phrases that made little sense at the time but lingered in the memory. As she and William rode out of Redemption, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind, the old woman's words echoed louder than Caleb's mockery. She pulled out the map, studying the winding creek. It wasn't a creek. Thomas had drawn it with feathered, branching lines, more like a tree's root system than a waterway. A new kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the coming winter, settled over her. The first heavy snow came 2 weeks later, a thick, wet fall that sealed the high country in a blanket of white. It found Emma and William in a state of shared, frantic labor. Their days had fallen into a rhythm dictated by necessity. From dawn until dusk, they worked on the shack. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was a comfortable, well-worn thing, broken only by essential questions and observations. "Hand me the hammer. This beam is rotted through. Another storm's coming from the north." Emma had never worked so hard in her life. She learned to mix mud and grass into chinking to seal the gaps between the logs, her hands becoming raw and chapped. She helped William stretch a new piece of canvas over the hole in the roof, her arms aching from holding it taut against the wind. She learned the smell of pine sawdust, the heft of an axe, the particular weariness that comes from a day spent fighting against decay. The shack, under their combined efforts, began to transform. It was still a small, rough place, but the wind no longer screamed through the walls, and the roof held against the rain. It was becoming defensible. Their arrival back from redemption had marked a subtle shift. William had seen Caleb's cruelty firsthand, and though he said nothing, he seemed to look at Emma with a new, grudging respect. He had seen her stand her ground without flinching. One evening, as they sat by the fire, mending tools in the flickering light, he spoke without preamble. "My wife, Sarah, she died of a fever 2 years back," he said, his eyes fixed on the piece of leather he was stitching. "This was supposed to be our place. We were going to build a proper house right here. Said the valley ranches were getting too crowded." He fell silent, the memory hanging in the air between them. Emma, patching a tear in her dress, simply nodded. "Thomas talked about this place the same way," she offered quietly. "He said it was quiet enough to hear the world breathe. It was the most they had ever shared, an exchange of ghosts, a quiet acknowledgement of the losses that had driven them both to this isolated scrap of land. The shack was no longer just his or hers. It was a shelter for their shared griefs. After the first big snow, they were truly cut off. The world shrank to the walls of the cabin, the small, cleared path to the woodpile, and the vast, silent expanse of white. Emma would often stand in the doorway, looking out at the landscape, now softened and simplified by the snow. She'd pull out the map, comparing its lines to the visible ridges. Caleb had called it foolishness, but the more time she spent here, the more she felt its strange accuracy. The Sleeping Giant Ridge was a perfect match. The stand of 3 ancient pines on the northern hill was exactly where Thomas had drawn it. One afternoon, while sweeping the packed dirt floor near the hearth, her broom caught on a loose flagstone. It was a nuisance she'd noted before, but this time, preoccupied with the memory of the old woman's words, she stopped. She knelt down, running her fingers along its edge. It was shaped differently from the others, less jagged, almost purposefully cut. She pulled out the map. In the drawing of the shack's interior, a detail she'd previously overlooked, one stone by the hearth was marked with a tiny, almost invisible star. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked over at William, who was outside, clearing snow from the animal lean-to. This was a secret from the map. It was Thomas's secret. She felt a tremor of something electric, a connection to her husband across the veil of death. The stone refused to budge. It was heavy, settled deep into the earth. But the clue was there, a single, stubborn detail that refused to fit the narrative of a worthless, forgotten place. The map was not just a drawing of the land. It was an instruction manual. And she was standing on the first step. The discovery of the marked stone shifted something in Emma. It was no longer enough to simply survive the winter. A deeper current of purpose now pulled at her. She didn't tell William about it at first. The secret felt too fragile, too intimately tied to Thomas. For days, she lived with the knowledge, her eyes constantly drawn to the hearth, her mind racing. The map was a puzzle, and she had just found the corner piece. But how to proceed? She couldn't lift the stone on her own, and to ask for William's help would be to invite questions she wasn't ready to answer, to risk a skepticism that might shatter her fragile hope. So she turned her attention outward, to the other clues. The map showed the River of Roots, originating from a point behind the shack, in a shallow depression where a thicket of stubborn, snow-dusted aspens grew. One afternoon, driven by a restless energy, she took a shovel and began to clear the snow from that area. William watched her from the woodpile, his expression unreadable. "Ground's frozen solid," he stated, his voice flat. "Whatever you're looking for, it can wait for the thaw." "Just stretching my legs," she called back, her breath pluming in the frigid air. But she wasn't just digging randomly. She was observing. She noticed that the snow in the very center of the aspen grove was shallower than the surrounding drifts, as if some faint, residual warmth from the earth below were melting it from beneath. And she remembered something else. The coyotes. Their tracks often led to this thicket. They didn't shelter there. They seemed to be drawn to that one spot, sniffing at the ground before moving on. An animal's odd behavior. Another clue clicked into place. Her quiet investigation became part of their daily rhythm. While William hunted or tended to the horses, Emma would walk the land, map in hand, learning its contours, its secrets. The labor of their shared survival continued, a constant backdrop to her search. They raised a small, sturdy fence for the horses, using timber William had felled before she arrived. They insulated the last of the walls with a mixture of dried moss and mud she gathered from the banks of the half-frozen creek. Through this shared work, their unspoken partnership deepened. He began to show her things: how to read the clouds for an approaching storm, how to track a rabbit in the snow, how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. In return, she brought a sense of order to the cabin's chaotic interior, organizing their meager supplies, mending his worn clothes, making the small space feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a bastion against the wilderness. One evening, a week after her discovery of the shallow snow, a thaw set in. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and for 2 days, the snow receded, exposing patches of damp, brown earth. It was now or never. That night, by the fire, she finally spoke. "The flagstone by the hearth," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's loose, and it's marked on my husband's map." William stopped sharpening his knife and looked at her, his gaze intense. He didn't mock her. He had seen her dedication, her quiet certainty. He had seen how the map's landmarks had proven true time and again. He rose without a word, fetched a long iron pry bar from the corner, and walked to the hearth. He wedged the tip of the bar into the seam. "Stand back," he said. He put his weight into it, his muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of protest, the stone shifted, scraping against its neighbors. Together, they worked their fingers under the edge and lifted. It was heavy, thick, and damp on its underside. Beneath it was not a hidden cache of gold or a hollowed-out space, but something far more mundane and far more mysterious. Another map? This one carved into a second, larger stone tablet set deeper in the earth. It was a more detailed version of the paper map, But this one showed a complex network of channels leading from the aspen thicket directly to the foundation of the shack. It showed a system. William stared at the carving, his skepticism finally giving way to a raw, stunned curiosity. "What in God's name did your husband find out here?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emma looked from the stone map at their feet to the aspen grove outside, its bare branches stark against the evening sky. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. The roots hold the oldest water. "I think," she said, her voice filled with a dawning awe, "he found the source." The discovery of the stone map galvanized them. The project was no longer Emma's solitary quest. It became a shared obsession. The next morning, armed with shovels, picks, and the iron pry bar, they went to the aspen grove. The ground, softened by the Chinook, yielded to their efforts. William, with his lean strength, broke through the frozen topsoil, while Emma cleared away the loosened dirt and rock. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team fueled by the same unspoken question. As they dug deeper, the earth grew darker and damper. A clean, mineral scent, the smell of deep earth water, rose to meet them. About 4 feet down, William's shovel struck something hard and flat with a dull thunk. It wasn't a boulder. The sound was too uniform. Carefully, they cleared the dirt around it, their hands scrabbling in the cold mud. They uncovered the edge of a massive cut slab of sandstone, and then another and another, laid together with a precision that bespoke immense effort and skill. They had found a roof, buried beneath the earth. It took them the rest of the day to clear the slabs and find the entrance. It was a low, stone-lined doorway, sealed with a single, perfectly fitted stone plug. Using the pry bar and their combined strength, they worked it loose. A rush of cool, clean air, smelling of stone and water, washed over them. William lit a lantern, the flame casting flickering shadows, and crouched down to peer inside. Emma was right behind him. The lantern light revealed a small, vaulted chamber, walled and floored with masterfully cut stone. It was not a root cellar or a mine. It was a spring house. In the center of the floor, a pool of water, clear as glass, bubbled up from a source deep within the earth, filling a basin carved from a single piece of rock. The water was in constant, gentle motion, flowing into a covered stone channel that led off in the direction of the shack, the very channel depicted on the stone map beneath their hearth. It was an engineering marvel, hidden and perfectly preserved. "This water, it never freezes," William whispered, his voice filled with reverence. He touched the surface. It was cool, but not icy. This was the reason the snow melted faster here. This was what the animals knew. But there was more. As Emma's eyes adjusted to the light, she saw a small niche carved into the far wall, just above the waterline. Tucked inside was a tin box, the kind used for keeping tea or biscuits. It was heavy for its size and sealed with a thick layer of hardened wax. They brought the box back to the cabin, placing it on the rough-hewn table between them. The air was thick with anticipation. William carefully broke the wax seal with his knife and pried open the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried leaves, were 3 objects. The first was a small leather-bound ledger. The second was a collection of cloth packets containing seeds, each labeled with a careful, elegant script. The third was a folded document, tied with a leather cord. Emma reached for the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it. The first page contained a name and a date. Sparrow's Wing, 1845. The script was the same as on the seed packets. It was a journal, detailing the construction of the spring house, the planting of a garden, the flow of the water. It was a record of a life lived on this land, decades before the Whitcombs or the Mercers had ever seen it. William gently untied the leather cord and unfolded the document. It was a legal deed, penned by a traveling magistrate from Fort Laramie. It granted title of the 100 acres surrounding the spring, in perpetuity, to one Sparrow's Wing, a woman of the Shoshone people, in gratitude for saving the life of a trapper named Jean-Pierre Renaud. The deed was stamped, signed, and witnessed. It was ironclad. This land wasn't Mercer's grazing allotment. It had never been part of the Whitcomb Ranch. It belonged to a ghost. Thomas hadn't just found a spring. He had found a history, a legacy. He had uncovered a truth that changed everything. The weight of the discovery settled over the small cabin, profound and silencing. The deed lay on the table between them, a testament to a forgotten history and a claim far older and more legitimate than any of their own. For hours, they sat in silence, the lantern light guttering, each lost in their own thoughts. The spring house wasn't just a source of water, it was a monument. The land wasn't a barren plot to be owned, but a trust they had stumbled upon. Emma finally understood. Thomas hadn't been drawing a map to a place, but to a story that was now theirs to protect. That night, the weather turned. The brief respite of the Chinook was devoured by a gathering storm that swept down from the north with astonishing speed. The wind began to moan around the eaves of the cabin, a low, mournful sound that grew into a piercing shriek. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent that erased the world outside their windows. It was a true blizzard, the kind old-timers spoke of with a mixture of fear and respect. Inside, the cabin felt like the eye of the storm. The fire roared in the hearth, their repairs held fast against the wind's assault, and the air was filled with a strange, suspended peace. The deed and the ledger lay on the table, a silent testament to their new reality. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof for survival. They were custodians of a secret. "She writes about the garden," Emma said softly, breaking the long silence. She had been poring over Sparrow's Wing's ledger. She grew corn, squash, beans. She says the spring water meant she never had to worry about drought. She called this place the land that gives back. William nodded, his gaze distant. "My father used to say this patch of ground was worthless, too rocky for grazing, too high for farming." He looked at the ledger, at the proof of a life that had thrived here. He was wrong. The storm raged for 2 full days, imprisoning them in the small circle of their lantern light. They rationed their wood and food, the world outside a churning chaos of white. It was during this forced intimacy that the last of the walls between them finally crumbled. They talked for hours, sharing stories of the lives they had lived before loss had pared them down to their essential selves. He spoke of Sarah's laughter, and she spoke of Thomas's quiet kindness. They were no longer just archetypes, the widow, the widower, but two people finding solace in a shared shelter. On the third morning, the wind died down, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a deep, pristine silence. As the first light broke, they heard a faint sound from the east, a desperate, muffled shouting. William grabbed his rifle, his face grim. Trouble in this weather was deadly trouble. They found them less than a half-mile from the cabin, a family of German immigrants, a man, a pregnant woman, and a small boy. Their wagon hopelessly mired in a snowdrift, one wheel splintered. They were half frozen, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The man, whose name was Heinrich, explained in broken English that they had been trying to reach a relative's homestead, before the storm hit and had lost the trail. Without a word, William and Emma led them back to the shack. Emma wrapped the shivering woman and child in every blanket they had, placing them by the fire and giving them warm broth. William and Heinrich, using the horses, managed to unhitch the oxen and lead them to the lean-to for shelter. For the next week, the tiny cabin became a crowded, noisy sanctuary. The boy, Otto, quickly recovered his spirits, his laughter filling the small space. His mother, Elspeth, watched Emma with wide, grateful eyes. They shared their food, their water, their warmth, stretching their meager supplies to accommodate their unexpected guests. It was in this act of selfless giving that Emma saw the true meaning of what they had found. The spring house wasn't a treasure to be hoarded. It was a resource to be shared. The land that gives back. She was living Sparrow's Wings' legacy. This was the test. It wasn't about ownership or legal claims. It was about choosing to build a haven in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving world. As soon as the snow had hardened enough to travel, Heinrich, profoundly grateful, promised to send word from Redemption. Before he left, he stood at the door, his hat in his hands. "You have a good place here," he said, his gaze taking in the solid cabin and the clear, constant trickle of water from the pipe William had rigged from the spring. A place of life. Just as Heinrich's family was preparing to depart, another rider appeared, silhouetted against the bright snow. It was Caleb Whitcomb. He reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The repaired cabin, the smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, the strangers preparing to leave. Suspicion and anger radiated from him. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Running a hotel now, Mercer?" He looked at Emma, a sneer twisting his lips. "Still playing homesteader on land that isn't yours?" Before Emma could speak, William stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Caleb. He was calm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "This land was never yours to give away, Caleb," William said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "And it was never mine to claim." He held out the deed. "You should read this, carefully." The departure of Heinrich's family was like a stone tossed into a still pond, sending ripples out across the high country. They reached Redemption not just with a story of survival, but with a tale of near miraculous sanctuary. They spoke of a hidden spring of sweet, ever-flowing water, a warm cabin, and the quiet, capable couple who had taken them in without a moment's hesitation. The story flew from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith to the stables. The whispers that had once followed Emma were replaced by a new chorus of curiosity and respect. A week later, a man on a fine-looking horse rode up to the shack. He was older, with a neat gray beard and spectacles, and he introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a circuit lawyer and land agent out of Cheyenne. He had heard the story from Heinrich and, his professional interest piqued, had come to see the deed for himself. William and Emma invited him in. They laid the deed and Sparrow's Wings ledger on the table. Mr. Abernathy spent over an hour examining them, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held the deed up to the light, studied the seals, and read every word of the ledger with meticulous care. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and the crackle of the fire. Finally, he looked up, his expression one of quiet astonishment. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice hushed with something akin to reverence. "The deed is impeccably legal. The signatures are authentic. I recognize Magistrate Thorne's hand from other territorial documents of the period. And this ledger, This is a historical record of profound significance. He looked from Emma to William. This land, this 100 acres and its water rights, are not public domain. They are a private holding, legally deeded. He explained the legal standing. The land belonged to the descendants of Sparrow's Wing. If no descendants could be found after a thorough search, the deed stipulated the land was to be held in a territorial trust, managed for the public good, to preserve the water source. It can never be sold or absorbed into a neighboring ranch, he concluded, looking pointedly in the direction of the Whitcomb property. Its status is unique and protected. The news of Mr. Abernathy's verdict solidified Emma's and William's new standing in the community. Caleb Whitcomb, when presented with the lawyer's findings, had no choice but to retreat. He was humbled not by a show of force, but by the quiet, irrefutable power of the truth. His greed had been checked by a piece of paper he'd never known existed, a legacy written by a woman whose name he would never have learned. He was seen in Redemption a few weeks later, buying a round at the saloon, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a sullen quiet. As spring finally arrived, melting the last of the snow and turning the foothills a vibrant green, people began to arrive. Not in a rush, but in a slow, steady trickle. A family whose well had gone dry came to fill their barrels. A group of Shoshone riders, having heard the story through their own channels, came to see the home of their ancestor, standing by the spring house in silent, prayerful tribute. They thanked Emma and William for honoring her memory. The townspeople who had once mocked Emma now greeted her with nods of respect. She and William were no longer outcasts. They were the keepers of the spring, stewards of Sparrow's Wing's gift. The community, once a source of judgment, now looked to them as the quiet, steady heart of the foothills. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new pine growth. Emma stood beside the spring house, a bucket of clear, cold water in her hand. The land around them was alive. The seeds from Sparrow's Wing's packets, planted in a small, tilled garden plot, had begun to sprout, their green shoots pushing determinedly toward the sky. The trickle of water from the spring was the land's quiet heartbeat. William came and stood beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. They watched the last of the sun's fire catch on the highest peaks. In the months since the blizzard, a new rhythm had settled over their lives. They managed the spring, helped the travelers who came seeking water, and worked the small garden. Mr. Abernathy had begun the official search for Sparrow's Wing's descendants, a process he said could take years. Until then, he had appointed them official caretakers of the trust. They were, for the first time, exactly where they were supposed to be. The shack had become a home. Emma's touch was everywhere, in the clean-swept floors, the neatly stacked shelves, the wildflowers in a tin can on the table. William's quiet strength was in the solid roof, the sturdy fence, the constant, reassuring presence of a full woodpile. The ghosts of their pasts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the small rooms. They had become gentle memories, integrated into the foundation of a new life. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly. Looking out at the wash of color over the mountains, William nodded, his gaze not on the sunset, but on her. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice low, "when they find her family?" It was the question that had hung unspoken between them for months. Emma looked at the small, sturdy cabin, its windows glowing with the warm light of the lantern she had lit inside. She looked at the fresh, green shoots in the garden, a promise of life to come. She looked at William, his weathered face softened by the twilight, the wariness in his eyes long since replaced by a deep and steady affection. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the cruelty, the dust and exhaustion. She thought of the worthless piece of paper that had been her only guide. "Thomas left me a map to a place," she said, her voice clear and sure in the quiet air. "I think we found a way to build a home." He reached out and took her free hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was an answer and a promise. The home was not the land, or the cabin, or the water. It was this. Together, they turned and walked back toward the light. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and unexpected inheritance. If you were moved by the journey of finding home in the most unlikely of places, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Let us know in the comments what a map to your special place might look like. We'll see you again soon.